Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 7th installment of our WACNH live virtual event series. We're so happy you've decided to join us this afternoon. And for those of you who are watching the replay, we are excited to have the opportunity to engage with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's programming. I do hope that you are all staying well, both physically and mentally, in these trying times and are glad you are a part of our global community. With coronavirus still a worry for many, community support is the only way we'll come out of this crisis stronger. Our usual host and the World Affairs Council's Executive Director, Tim Horgan, is not here today as he and his wife are currently awaiting the birth of their first child. So we would like to wish them both good luck on their burgeoning family. Due to Tim's absence, I am very happy to welcome as the moderator for our Q&A section today, Melinda Negron Gonzalez, who is a professor of political science at UNH, specializing in global studies and the Middle East. I would also like to quickly turn the introduction for today's event over to Maura Sullivan, who currently serves as a member of our organization's board of directors and graciously agreed to speak today on such short notice. So thank you, Maura, and the floor is yours.
Terrific. Hello, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. It's really exciting to see members of our community, friends and neighbors from all around New Hampshire, and then also throughout the globe who've joined us here tonight. Thank you. As Michael said, my name is Maura Sullivan, and I am a board member for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. WACNH is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to helping people better understand the challenges that we are facing the world today. In the midst of the coronavirus epidemic and as Black Lives Matter protests occur around the world, it is more important than ever that all of us understand the enormous challenges that our global community faces together. And as such, the work that the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire does is vitally important right now, and is why we have committed as an organization to continuing to bring timely online programs to New Hampshire throughout this pandemic, even when we can't meet in person, and to our global community. As a membership organization, the Council is supported by the generous community of citizens, both here in New Hampshire and around the globe. These programs are made possible by these members and donors, ensuring that the Council's vital work can continue. We thank and appreciate everybody who assists the Council and hope that if you are not a member yet, that you will consider joining or donating to help maintain and grow our very important work and programs. You can find more information on our website or make a tax-deductible contribution to the organization by texting WACNH to 44321. And again, your help is so very much appreciated. We would in particular like to thank our great sponsors who have made these virtual events possible. Thank you from all of us at WACNH to the John Bickford Foundation, Charles and Barbara Bickford, Stephen and Karen Barndollar, as well as Helen Taft and Peter Bowman. You are all wonderful supporters, and we thank you for all that you have done to make this series just such an incredible success. In addition, we'd like to thank our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University, for all of their support that they have provided right now and also over the past 20 years. The Council is stronger for your commitment. For those that are joining us here at the World Affairs Council for the first time, welcome. We are so glad to see you. We will be taking questions throughout the evening, so please do send us your queries so that we can have a full and robust discussion after the presentation. You can send questions that you have to our email address, which is council@wacnh.org, or send them to our social media accounts. Finally, and with no further ado, I am very, very excited to get to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Paul Pillar retired in 2005 from a 28-year career in the United States intelligence community, in which his last position was Naval Intelligence Officer for Near East and South Asia. Earlier, he served in a variety of analytical and managerial positions, including as Chief of Analytic Units at the CIA, covering portions of the Near East, the Persian Gulf, and South Asia. Pillar also served in the National Intelligence Council as one of the original members of its analytic group, He has been executive assistant to the CIA's Deputy Director for Intelligence and executive assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence, the DCI, William Webster. He has also headed the Assessments and Information Groups of the DCI Counterterrorist Center, and from 1997 to 1999 was Deputy Chief of the Center. He was a Federal Executive Fellow at the Brookings Institution, a retired officer in the United States Army Reserve, and served on active duty in the Army from 1971 to 73, including a tour in Vietnam. Dr. Pillar, thank you very much for your service. Now, Dr. Pillar is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Security Studies in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, a contributing editor at the National Interest, and works with the Iran Project, which helped make tonight's event possible. Without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm Granite State welcome to Dr. Paul Pillar.
Thank you very much, Maura, for the introduction. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the bio that I might note is I went to college at Dartmouth. So my main New Hampshire experience was 4 years as a student way back in the 1960s, although I've certainly enjoyed some visits to your state since then. I'm going to talk about U.S. policy toward Iran and how some of the Iranian reactions have gone, as well as the current situation in Iran with regard to economics and public health and politics, and then talk about some more current diplomatic issues. The main defining document, if you will, of U.S.-Iranian relations in recent years has been the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal, which entered into force 5 years ago in 2015. After that, for the subsequent 3 years, the Iranians made good on their commitments, and they had to do most of what they were required to do under that agreement right in the very beginning before they got an ounce of sanctions relief. They had to fill one of their reactors, nuclear reactors, with cement. They gave up 98% of their enriched uranium. They had to subject themselves, as they still do, to the most comprehensive international inspection regime that a country has voluntarily agreed to submit themselves to as far as nuclear matters. And the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, certified that the Iranians have lived up to their commitments. That was the story up until 2018. And despite that record of 3 years of compliance, it was in May of 2018 that the Trump administration decided to renounce the agreement, renege on all the U.S. Commitments. Despite the U.S. violations, and actually the administration had begun violating the agreement somewhat earlier than that by discouraging economic commerce with Iran, the Iranians for another year continued to abide by all of the nuclear restrictions that bound them under the JCPOA. Their patience ran out after a year in the spring of last year, 2019, when the Trump administration escalated its campaign of maximum pressure to basically unrestricted economic warfare on Iran, using sanctions that went well beyond what Iran was subject to for nuclear reasons, and finding every way they could to pressure third parties not to do business with Iran, with the goal being to try to bring Iranian oil exports to zero, commerce with the outside world as close to zero as possible, and basically hurt the Iranian economy as much as the U.S. possibly could. The Iranians have responded in two ways to that U.S. policy. One is to take a series of steps in which they have exceeded the nuclear limits to which they had agreed under the JCPOA and which they had observed for 4 years. These have been a series of small steps, mainly involving uranium enrichment, that came in about 5 stages. As a result of that, they are now over some of the limits. For example, the limit with regard to the low enriched uranium that they were allowed to have was a limit of 300 kilograms of uranium hexafluoride, which is the gaseous form that's used for enrichment. They now have about 5 times that much, about 1,500 kilograms. and some of it has been enriched slightly above what had been the limit of 3.67% to 4.5%. They also are running more centrifuges for enrichment. Now, the Iranians have stressed repeatedly that these are very reversible steps, and they are, and have repeatedly said that they are quite anxious to come back into full compliance with the agreement as soon as the United States does. But of course, that hasn't happened as far as US policy is concerned. What the Iranians are basically doing is using these steps, or trying to use it as a form of counter pressure to meet the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration. It's the same thing they were doing back several years ago before the JCPOA was even negotiated. Although they haven't gotten anywhere near to the levels of enrichment and the size of the stockpiles that they acquired before the agreement was signed. There's no indication that they are using this as anything other than pressure and to try to get the United States to get back in compliance. There's no indication that they're making any race to a nuclear weapon. Nonetheless, because of these steps, they are somewhat closer, if they did choose to go for a nuclear weapon, than they were before. Many of the analysts talk in terms of breakout time, you know, what a country could do if it chose to make a race for a bomb. Before the nuclear agreement was signed, that breakout time for Iran had gotten down, by most estimates, to only a couple of months. After the agreement, it was knocked back to a full year. Now, I think most of the analysts would say it's, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 months. The other thing that the Iranians have done is to take a more active stance militarily in the region. Specifically, we have had a number of armed incidents that have occurred over the last several months, including some sabotage of tankers off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. And then most spectacularly, last September was an attack carried out with a combination of drones and cruise missiles against a couple of critical, especially one critical facility, oil facility in Saudi Arabia. The Iranians weren't doing anything like that before, not before the Trump administration renounced the agreement. The attack on the Saudi facilities was intended not only to send a message to the United States, but also to the Saudis and the other Gulf Arabs as a reminder of the harm that might come to them, even as just collateral damage, if the US or anyone else were to strike Iran militarily. It was a form of, to use the US jargon, establishing deterrence. Part of the other background to that, I should note, is that Iranian leaders have said more than once that basically if we can't export our oil, then our competitors on the other side of the Gulf are going to have trouble exporting theirs as well. And one could look at the September attack as one way of trying to make that point. There have been some other, armed activity, especially in Iraq, but it's best explained, and some of this involves some militia groups that have had some association with Iran. It's best explained as a tit-for-tat retaliation for some of the things that the U.S. has done. And certainly the most forceful thing between the U.S. and Iran that's taken place during this time was the assassination, the killing with a missile fired from a drone of Qasem Soleimani, who was the commander of what's called the Quds Force in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, an operation that took place while he and a senior Iraqi official were at the Baghdad airport in Iraq. It's hard not to, it's hard to overstate the significance and the importance of Soleimani in Iran. He had a significance much greater than just his formal title as head of the Quds Force. By a lot of estimations, he was probably second only to the supreme leader in his influence over Iranian policy in the region. He was also a very prominent and very popular figure among the Iranian population generally, as indicated by how his funeral went. According to Western journalist observers, there were probably 1 million people who turned out in the streets for the funeral procession in Tehran, and that was in addition to other large-scale processions in other Iranian cities that totaled in the several millions. Inside Iran today, the economic picture is very, very grim. And there are multiple reasons for this. Some of this is the mismanagement of the Iranians themselves or of their own economy. But undoubtedly, the US sanctions are the biggest part of this. The International Monetary Fund, before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, had estimated that the Iranian efforts to strive for self-sufficiency in their economy and to find ways to overcome the sanctions and the isolation were having some success, to the extent that the IMF expected that the Iranian economy might, by the end of this year, finish its contraction and actually start expanding a bit. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown all of that out the window. Now, most of the estimates are that since the pandemic started earlier this year, the Iranian economy has contracted by probably another 15% or so. COVID-19 hit Iran especially hard, as I think most of you know. It was one of the early hotspots out of China. There are a number of reasons why this occurred. Again, some of them get to mismanagement by the Iranian regime itself, but some of them are related also to the sanctions and to the US maximum pressure policy. In particular, the Iranian authorities were very reluctant to cut off the commerce and contacts with China, given that China has become kind of an economic lifeline for the Iranians. And so the air transportation and the trade and so on continued. Clearly, this had something to do with spreading the virus rapidly from China to Iran. The Iranian authorities were also very reluctant to close down things like mosques and religious seminaries. And this was not very good with regard to controlling the virus, particularly because one of the early hotspots inside Iran was Qum, the so-called holy city, where you had seminary students and pilgrims going in and out with no restriction at all. And this was a major factor in spreading the disease as well. Iran's part in this whole pandemic, because it came earlier, reached a peak back in March. And after the measures that the regime did take in response, the infection rate slowed through April and into about the first week in May. Since then, there has been a resurgence, and just within the last 2 or 3 weeks, the infection rate in Iran has gotten back slightly above what had been its peak back in the earlier peak in March, of more than 3,000 new cases per day. So given that it earlier peaked in what could be called the first wave of the COVID-19, it's fair to say that Iran is already suffering a second wave. And this clearly had a lot to do with the efforts by the Iranian authorities to reopen their economy. President Rouhani was talking about that in late April. And that may have some object lessons for some of the rest of us in other countries with regard to economic reopening and the hazard of a second wave. The US sanctions have, in several ways, impeded the ability of the Iranians to deal with the virus. There have been shortages because of the sanctions of personal protective equipment, of the raw ingredients to some of the medicines that the Iranians themselves would otherwise be making, and other supplies and equipment. Partly for this reason, there have been multiple appeals, and we just heard a new one just the other day from the Turkish foreign minister. But about a month ago, there was a open letter from former cabinet-level officials in both Europe and the United States, appealing to the U.S. administration to relax its sanctions enough so that the Iranians could do a better job of protecting their population from the disease. The Trump administration's response to this is to say that there already is an exemption from the sanctions for humanitarian traffic, including medicines, which is true, but it leaves unstated what the effect of all the other sanctions are on any trade in medicine and other humanitarian goods. Basically, what's happening is that foreign suppliers and manufacturers, including pharmaceuticals and financial institutions, are still scared to death of the US Treasury, scared that they might even inadvertently cross some line that would make them subject to US sanctions and penalties and exclusion from the US market. So despite the formal exemptions for medicine and other humanitarian goods, there's been virtually no trade to take advantage of that. And more specifically, the United States administration had worked out in connection with the Swiss a channel that was supposed to be for medical and other humanitarian matters. It came into effect in January. So far, there's been just one pilot trade in January, and that's it. There hasn't been another transaction. The story is basically the same with another channel that the Europeans set up that became known as Instex, which has had one trade and not another one. And so the broader sanctions, despite the exemptions, are still very much having a heavy effect, including on the virus situation. Now, the Trump administration officials surely know all this, even though they may not admit it publicly. And this gets to the question of just what the U.S. objectives are. We've heard things about a better deal referring to the nuclear question. But the only specific things that the administration has formally put on the table, and this was in a speech by Secretary Pompeo some time back, which was a list of about a dozen demands that were really so extreme, basically telling Iran that it can't have a foreign policy, that they weren't anything that any Iranian leader could agree to and live politically to tell the tale. I think it's more accurate analytically to say that the main administration hope is still regime change, that through the maximum pressure, they would somehow destabilize and preferably topple the Iranian regime as it exists now. And in that context, the suffering of civilians from the disease or from anything else related to the sanctions is actually a good thing, because it's seen as a source of dissatisfaction that will ultimately result in more pressure and more destabilization on the regime. And that's why the administration so far has seen the COVID-19 pandemic and how hard it's hit Iran, not as an occasion for easing up on the sanctions, but rather a reason, all the more reason to keep the pedal to the metal as far as sanctions and pressure is concerned. That dream of regime change is still basically that, a dream, especially if we're talking about the kind of change that we in the United States might consider a change for the better, as opposed to one for the worse. Many times over the last 4-decade history of the Islamic Republic, we've heard that sort of dream expressed and expectations that with a little more pressure, that regime's going to fall. It never seems to happen. There certainly is dissatisfaction today among many Iranians with the performance of their authorities when it comes to public health and when it comes to economics. But most Iranians are perceptive enough to realize the very major role that U.S. sanctions have had in all of this. Moreover, there's no real viable opposition movement, an alternative regime ready to step into power that has the kind of popular support that would make that feasible. Most Iranians are just trying to get by rather than, and some of them trying to get out, rather than trying to make a revolution. Meanwhile, the main political effect of the sanctions and of the pressure inside Iran has been to bolster the position of the hardliners at the expense of other elements inside the regime that we would consider to be pragmatist or moderates. President Rouhani is one of the latter, and he and Foreign Minister Zarif and others who were associated with the nuclear agreement negotiation have been discredited because of the U.S. renouncing of it. The hardliners have been saying, "We told you so. It was a mistake trying to negotiate with those Americans. They're perfidious. Look what they've done to us now." The Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, takes the same line, although he gave Rouhani and Zarif enough slack to negotiate the agreement. He coupled that with repeated expressions of skepticism, and now he too is saying, "I told you so." The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, has actually, suffered less from the economic sanctions than most of the general population, partly because of its control of smuggling and and other ways in which it has a grip on much of the Iranian economy. Moreover, many ordinary Iranians have become more dependent than ever on the charitable foundations called banyads that are associated with the regime and especially with the supreme leader. In short, they have all the more reason not to rock the boat in terms of making a new revolution. And I would add on top of all that, when you have a viral pandemic in process, that's not a very good time for organizing something like mass demonstrations in the street. There are a few things that are currently in the hopper that the Trump administration has made as initiatives that have either just taken place or about to take place. One, which happened just a couple of weeks ago, was the administration announced that they are ending the last of the waivers that were still in effect of their anti-Iranian sanctions, waivers of sanctioning third parties for doing business with Iran. And these had to do with certain activity that the British, Russians, and Chinese are involved in to make the Iranian nuclear program even more proliferation resistant than the other provisions in the agreement had already made it. Specifically, involved some work to redesign one nuclear reactor so it would never produce more than a trivial amount of plutonium. It involves taking off the hands of the Iranians spent reactor fuel so they can't do anything more with it in terms of trying to turn it into weapons fissionable material. And it involves supplying the Iranians with 20% enriched uranium for one of their reactors called the Tehran Research Reactor, which they use for producing medical isotopes for cancer treatment and so on, thereby not giving the Iranians any excuse or rationale for resuming 20% enrichment themselves, something that they were doing back before the JCPOA came into effect. This is clearly what the administration did, clearly is counterproductive as far as nuclear non-proliferation objectives are concerned. But I think the way you explain it is their objective isn't non-proliferation. Their objective is to try to destroy the JCPOA as comprehensively as possible so that even, say, a Biden administration coming into the office next year would have difficulty resurrecting it. There's another issue that the administration has brought up, which you'll be probably reading more about in the weeks ahead. There is an arms embargo that has been in effect as part of the UN sanctions against Iran that is due, this is a conventional arms embargo, it is due to expire this October, 5 years after the JCPOA went into effect. Now, it's important to understand, even though the embargo has to do with conventional arms, it really was just one more multilateral nuclear sanction placed on Iran to induce Tehran to negotiate restrictions on their nuclear program. And so they did exactly that in agreeing to the JCPOA, and for that reason, this particular sanction, like the other multilateral sanctions, ought to have come off. But during the negotiation, the United States argued to wait for 5 years before lifting this particular sanction, and hence we have this October date coming up. It would be hard to make a legitimate case for singling out Iran as far as being the major problem in the Middle East with conventional arms transfer is concerned. I mean, their part of that arms trade has been very small. By contrast, well, the main part of that story as a seller is concerned is the United States, and the main part of the story as far as the Middle East arms trade goes, as far as buyers are concerned, is Saudi Arabia. And just to point out on that one pair of buyer and sellers, the United States and Saudi Arabia have signed statements of intent that would provide for $350 billion, that's over $1 trillion worth of arms over the next 10 years. So this really isn't, again, a matter of trying to control conventional arms when we're talking about the embargo on Iran. Russia and probably China as well are very much opposed to changing the terms of the agreement. to extend the arms embargo. You need a new UN Security Council resolution to do it. And so we can expect that Russia at least would veto it. And the Trump administration has already indicated, well, their next step, if that happens, is to try to, in an effort to try to get more multilateral sanctions back on Iran, is to invoke something called the snapback provision of the JCPOA. Now, this has to do with some clever bit of wording of the nuclear agreement that was intended to reassure everyone back in 2015 that if the Iranians started to cheat and started to violate their restrictions under the agreement, that they would quickly and automatically be subject again to those UN sanctions without being protected by something like a veto by Russia or China that would prevent that reimposition of sanctions. Basically, the snapback provision says if one of the other parties to the agreement, like the United States, declares that the Iranians are in violation, then those old UN sanctions will be reimposed unless you had a new UN Security Council resolution that said otherwise. And of course, the US could always veto a new resolution. Well, the strange part in all this is that the United States, the Trump administration, got out of the JCPOA 2 years ago. And as they did so, they made no bones about how they were no longer going to participate in it. They wanted nothing more to do with it. So to call them a participant with the right to invoke the snapback provision is a little strange, to put it mildly. And in fact, all the other parties to the agreement think it's rather ludicrous to argue that way. The Russians have been the most frank in talking about that, and they submitted a formal letter to the Security Council the other day, which states that. Nonetheless, if the United States could get, say, a small country that happened to hold the rotating presidency of the Security Council to declare what the U.S. wanted it to declare, that Iran is in violation and the sanctions ought to be reimposed, that sort of scenario may come to play. And looking ahead to some of the countries that hold the presidency of the Security Council over the next few months, it includes the likes of Niger and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So this is a real possibility. If that did happen, then you could expect Russia and China and probably others simply to ignore the snapback provision, and you'd have nothing less than a constitutional crisis in the UN Security Council with major repercussions that would go well beyond the Iran issue and get into larger questions of the continued authority and function of the UN Security Council. All of this, of course, is part of the U.S. effort, the U.S. administration effort to try to kill the JCPOA once and for all. Well, finally, I would just note that in recent weeks, there has been some observations of a more optimistic sort that the temperature of tension between the U.S. and Iran seems to have abated a bit. And maybe there's just too much distraction with other things going on, but the particular data point that is worth mentioning was another prisoner exchange, which took place just 2 weeks ago. It involved an American named Michael White, whom the Iranians released. And going in the other way were 2 Iranians, one scientist and one doctor, who had been detained here in the United States, and they were sent back to Iran. Now, with the scientist, the Trump administration says he wasn't really part of the deal. He was somebody they were going to deport anyway, but the Iranians had already made it clear that they were going to wait to see that there was movement on his case before they were going to move on Michael White's case. This is the second such prisoner exchange that's taken place over the last few months. There was an earlier one that involved a Princeton graduate student who had been doing research inside Iran. These certainly are favorable developments, and I should note there still are some more Americans or dual Iranian-American citizens, and the Iranian regime doesn't recognize them as dual citizens. They just call them Iranians, who are incarcerated on what seem to be trumped up charges in Iran. And there are more opportunities for this kind of exchange to take place. Meanwhile, though, with maximum pressure still at the maximum, there is a very tense situation that always carries the danger of escalating into something more violent, including use of arms. The Iranian regime is certainly not looking for a war, and I don't think Donald Trump is looking for a war at this point either. But there are ways in which such a conflict could break out despite the intentions of either side. One is some kind of accident that spins out of control among, say, naval elements in the Persian Gulf. You may recall an incident back during the Obama administration when a couple of small US Navy craft wandered into Iranian territorial waters. They had some kind of problem with their navigational equipment. It wasn't necessarily an intentional incursion, but the Iranians did what we obviously would do if Iranian vessels strayed into our territorial waters. They seized the craft and the crew. Fortunately, we had a channel of communications at the foreign minister level that was a byproduct of the negotiations on the nuclear program. And John Kerry got on the phone to Javad Zarif, his Iranian counterpart, and 24 hours later, we had our vessels and our crew safely back. One shudders to think if that same kind of incident were to occur today, when there's no such channel of communication and you have the Trump administration with the emphasis that it has with regard to hostility toward Iran. Accidents still happen. There was an incident just last month in which the Iranian naval forces in the Gulf had a friendly fire incident in which one of their craft fired accidentally at another of their craft, killing 19 of their own sailors. Fortunately, that didn't balloon into something that involved the United States, but it is a reminder of how these sorts of fatal accidents are still happening and they could spin into something else. Another source of possible escalation to a wider conflict would be simply miscalculation by one side or the other. And we have to bear in mind that the current situation with all the sanctions is still an unsatisfactory situation from the Iranian point of view. And going back to the thinking as I described it that lay behind their attacks on the Saudi oil facilities last fall, I don't think we've seen necessarily the last of that, even if for the time being, the Iranians are not trying to rock the boat. And as they look at events here in the United States and read the opinion polls, they probably have at least as much hope as they did several months ago that they will be able to see regime change in Washington come January 2021. There are other wild cards. The Israeli government is another one, always anxious to head off any kind of rapprochement between Iran and the United States and keep Iran out there as the leading bête noire in the region. So there's a possibility for stirring things up that could lead to an incident escalating out of control. And finally, although, and I emphasize, I don't think Donald Trump is looking for a war, we've still got another almost 5 months between now and Election Day in November. And depending on how the economic situation, the public health situation, and the opinion polls go between now and then, I don't think we can firmly rule out some kind of desperation move, a wag the dog type maneuver that would be a last minute attempt to rally the flag. Well, on that note, let me stop and I look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Pillar, for your great talk. And I will bring in Dr. Negron Gonzalez so that we can move into our Q&A section.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, Dr. Pillar, for illuminating these complex issues. That was great. If I may, I'd like to start with a question. And we've received some great questions here. So I'm going to start with a question of my own, and then I'm going to take some of the audience's questions. So I was hoping, Dr. Pillar, that you could bring out your crystal ball for a moment and discuss what Iran policy would look like under Trump's second term as president, and then perhaps discuss what U.S. policy toward Iran would look like under a Biden administration.
Well, in a second Trump administration, excuse me, I don't see much more than really more of the same. I mean, every sort of increment in the policy so far, going back to 2 years ago, when they left the nuclear agreement, has just been to try to find something more to sanction, some other way to exert more pressure. Now they've all just about run out of things to sanction. I mean, you'll hear every month or so, Secretary Pompeo will make an announcement that they found a couple of other individuals to be sanctioned as individuals. But I really don't see the kind of strategy or thinking that would point them in another direction. And if Mr. Trump is reelected, that would relieve the kind of immediate pressure that I was speculating about at the very end of my comments. So basically more of the same. And I think that means more of the same in terms of some of what the Iranian response would be. And I think we would see some more episodes of things like the attack on the Abqaiq oil facility in Saudi Arabia last September. A Biden administration, former Vice President Biden has stated that he and basically the other Democratic candidates for the nomination before they lost out to Mr. Biden were saying the same things, that they would re-enter the JCPOA and bring it back into full force. Now, I hasten to add, as even some of the analysts who have been most supportive of that agreement have pointed out, time has gone by. And you might actually see some kind of modification of the agreement to reflect the fact that some time has gone by. When the agreement was negotiated and brought into force under the Obama administration, the assumption would be that, okay, we're not just going to rest on our laurels, and that's the last thing that the US or Iranian governments are going to do with regard to relationships with each other. We've got other problems, other differences we have to talk about. And that whatever trust might have been built by the nuclear agreement could be used to build on and address some of these other issues, whether it has to do with internal security in Iraq or future of the war in Yemen, other things in which we have an interest and the Iranians have an interest. But basically, there hasn't been progress because it's been all maximum pressure and nothing else. Thus, there would have to be some very serious policy planning in the opening weeks of a Biden administration in terms of exactly what re-entry into the JCPOA would look like.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's a question from one of our viewers. Has there been any change in Iran's support of extremist groups in the Middle East like Hezbollah since the killing of Soleimani or since the coronavirus began?
There hasn't really been any change in something like the Iranian-Hezbollah relationship that you can attribute to either changes in U.S. policy or the disease or anything else. So the short answer to the question is no. You've got some constants in Iranian strategic interest in the region with specific reference to Lebanese Hezbollah. It has always been a major non-state ally of the Iranians. It has been an entree of Iranian influence into particularly the Shia population in Lebanon, and more recently, Hezbollah has served in effect as a mercenary force in supporting the Assad regime, another ally of the Iranians, in the Syrian civil war. You hear a lot of the rhetoric in this country, especially of those attacking the nuclear agreement, has tried to attribute major change in Iranian regional activity to changes in the diplomacy and in U.S. policy. The allegation that, once they signed the nuclear agreement, they got the sanctions relief, that would give them all sorts of resources to be much more aggressive in the region. Well, we saw absolutely no evidence of that. There's good reason we didn't see evidence, because they really didn't get that big of a windfall, even when our government was observing the JCPOA. To the extent we've had any change at all in the aggressiveness of Iran, it's the one I identified earlier. In response to maximum pressure, they have upped the ante with regard to things like the kinetic attacks on the oil trade as it affects the Gulf Arab states. So short answer, no particular change for those reasons. And I don't think I can identify anything that's related to COVID-19 that would be a change in that activity either.
Okay, another question about Soleimani. Realistically, how close were the U.S. and Iran to war in January after Soleimani's killing? Are the effects of that situation still being felt now?
Well, by some accounts, it got very close, not necessarily at the time of the Soleimani killing, but our president reportedly was at other times when the tension was high during those few months we're talking about, late last year, when he was on the verge of ordering a much bigger sort of operation than the ones that he did order inside Iraq. But we'll hope we don't come that close again. And as I said, I think the most recent weeks and months, the overall temperature seems to have eased a bit, aided by the prisoner exchange. As far as the lasting effects are concerned, the big lasting effect is the political and symbolic effect, if you will, in Iran. As I emphasized, Soleimani was an extremely important figure. It's hard to draw any kind of comparison here in the United States. I mean, you could say with regard to his formal title, it might be as if somebody assassinated a 4-star U.S. general who was a major combatant commander. But Soleimani was actually far, far more important than that in the Iranian context. So you imagine if, say, there was a 4-star general and maybe a U.S. cabinet officer and a senior U.S. senator or something all assassinated at once. You get some sense of how the Iranians in general viewed this. Although, if you look at the statements, the Iranians formally have already retaliated for the Soleimani killing. This was the missile barrage against a couple of Iraqi bases where U.S. personnel were. You may recall we did not suffer any fatalities from that. The casualties did, however, include some concussions and other kind of brain injuries to some of our troops. After that, the Iranian foreign minister made a statement that suggested, okay, we fired back, and now scores are settled. He didn't use those exact words. However, I think that was really just a way of saying, for now, we're not going to do anything else. The killing of Soleimani is going to persist and fester in the Iranian memory and the Iranian imagination, just like some other past, what are considered transgressions committed by the United States in the Iranian perception have persisted, such as our role in the overthrow of Mossadegh way back in 1953, and the shoot down of the Iranian airliner, killing more than 200 Iranians near the end of the Iran-Iraq War in 1988. You hear these things mentioned again and again and again, and we're just going to have added to that the Soleimani assassination.
Okay, another question about Iran's sponsorship of armed groups. Do you see Iran's current economic crisis increasing or decreasing their sponsorship of armed groups in the region?
Well, again, consistent with my response to an earlier question, the short answer is no. Much of the activity that really kind of causes heartburn to us isn't all that expensive. I'm talking about things like, well, for example, the material aid that's been given to the Houthis in Yemen. It's really, really small compared to what the Saudis and the UAE have done on the other side. Tiny, in fact. And similarly, it's not been a major fiscal outlay with regard to the relationships that the Iranians have cultivated with Iraqi militia groups in Iraq. So that's one reason. It's just most of that stuff's not that expensive compared to the overall budgetary problems that Iran faces. And secondly, it's just a matter, the same way we would approach it. There are certain things that the Iranian leadership considers essential to their security, and they're not going to become a nation of bookkeepers where they say, okay, how many reals do we have this month for nefarious activity and try to max out the account. That's not the way it works. They have certain strategic objectives and interests as they see them. They will continue to pursue those objectives, and the economic stringencies are not going to be the decisive factor.
Indeed. So here's a question about the effectiveness of sanctions. So do you see sanctions as an effective measure to compel Iran to change its behavior? Are there better ways to compel a change in behavior from Iran?
The general principle with regard to sanctions is, well, there are several general principles, one of which has to do with having multilateral support and broad support, which is why, UN approved sanctions, whether they're aimed at Iran or Libya or Syria or whoever the target is, are going to be more effective than just the unilateral ones. Let's face it, in this whole set of issues that I've been talking about, the nuclear agreement and so on, it's the US that's been more isolated than Iran. We're the party that's the odd man out with regard to the signatories of the JCPOA, not Iran. But the other important thing is just punishing somebody for not doing what we'd like them to do is only half of the equation. You have to get them persuaded that if they do what we want them to do, they won't be punished, and indeed they might even be rewarded. And there's, in the case of the way that the sanctions have been handled, certainly by the current U.S. administration vis-a-vis Iran, that part has simply been missing. There hasn't been a positive alternative, a way of getting to yes, that's out there. And especially when the Iranians face something like the imposition of sanctions, reimposition of sanctions starting in May of 2018, despite the fact that they were complying fully with the nuclear agreement. Well, the only conclusion they can reach is the U.S. is out to punish us no matter what we do. Well, that kills any incentive to change behavior. It's not an inducement to changing behavior. And so until we can get something that's on the positive side of the equation as well as the negative side, they're both important, then sanctions aren't going to have an effect.
So what is the possibility of a new administration rejoining the JCPOA, and what new form may the deal take, assuming the U.S. rejoins?
Well, as I briefly alluded, this is something that has yet to be worked out. Because of the passage of time. One of the things that people in particular point to is that the JCPOA, as originally written, has these so-called sunset clauses. There are certain provisions that are limitations on the Iranian nuclear program that are not permanent, but are to change or expire after a period of so many years. There are a bunch of them, and the periods vary. I hasten to emphasize that the most important provisions of the agreement are permanent. The basic prohibition on nuclear weapons, which amplifies an already existing Iranian commitment under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Also, the intrusive inspection arrangement, which in many ways is the most important part of the JCPOA, since it enables us to know exactly what the Iranians are doing. And we can react to any changes in their nuclear behavior very quickly. That's permanent as well. Nonetheless, you do have these other deadlines, and we're now 5 years closer to some of these expiration dates than we were before. So I would foresee there would have to be some new negotiation. It might lead to a modified version of the JCPOA that is more for more, to use a phrase that some of the analysts that follow these issues have used. That is to say, the Iranians would agree to extend some of their limitations farther into the future than was the case, than what they committed to under the original JCPOA. But we in the US would have to do more as well. And I think we might take the form of some more effective measures to normalize commerce with Iran. I mean, even going back to the Obama administration, which of course was supportive of the agreement, wasn't using maximum pressure, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, unsurprisingly, on the part of the Iranian regime with regard to the slowness with which commerce between Iran and the outside world picked up. And I think part of that was this fear effect that I mentioned of private sector entities wanting to be extra cautious. They didn't do anything that would compromise their access to U.S. markets. The Obama administration made a good faith effort to try to put out FAQs and to reassure foreign banks and so on that they could do such and such and it would be okay. I think under any kind of more for more agreement negotiated by a new U.S. administration with Iran, the Iranians would insist on something stronger so that the reintroduction of normal commerce could be more assured than what took place after the 2015 agreement.
Okay, thank you. So let's shift focus for a moment to Iraq. Can Iraq's new prime minister reduce Iranian influence in Iraq and alleviate anti-American sentiment in Iraqi domestic politics?
Well, hidden in that question is how much the new Iraqi prime minister wants to do along those lines. The new prime minister, who was a former intelligence chief, he met the two prime qualifications, namely that he would not be subject to an effective veto by either the United States or by Iran. So, he wasn't the first choice of either of us, but he's acceptable to both of us. It is a fact that we're not going to undo that there will be major Iranian influence in Iraq. They are neighbors. They share a 900-mile border. They fought an extremely costly, bloody 8-year war in the 1980s that neither side wants to repeat. For both countries, they realize they need to have at least a cordial relationship, even if it's not some kind of tight alliance, in order to avoid the horrors of the 1980s. And I think that's a perception of the current prime minister as well as others. As far as anti-Americanism is concerned, I think it's going to depend on U.S. policies and actions yet to play out. Certainly the assassination of Soleimani and where and how it was carried out was a big negative from the standpoint of Iraqi perceptions of the United States. I mean, this was a foreign leader who had arrived at the Baghdad airport, and he and a senior Iraqi security official, one associated with their militias, were killed by a U.S. drone strike. That's obviously, to put it mildly, a rather major abridgment of Iraqi sovereignty, not to mention some other things. And that's not going to sit well at all for a long, long time. The biggest bad thing, the biggest that's happened to Iraq in recent years, of course, and the biggest challenge they faced was the rise of ISIS, which built up their so-called caliphate, a mini-state that occupied much of western and northwestern Iraq, as well as a large part of Syria. We, the U.S., have had a role in assisting Iraq in defeating that caliphate. The Iranians had at least as big a role, I would say a bigger role. And so in terms of gratitude by Iraqis for that kind of help in beating back ISIS, there's at least as much gratitude that is being expressed toward Iran for pretty good reasons, as well as toward Iraq. I don't envy the job that the Iraqi prime minister has. It's a very difficult one, but those basically are the circumstances that he has to deal with.
Indeed. Michael, do we have time for one more question? Yes?
Yeah, I think we can do one more.
Okay, so speaking of ISIS, last question, since we haven't touched on Syria too much. Can you talk just a moment about the U.S.-Iran dimension in the Syrian civil war?
I think the one takeaway I would underscore there is the Iranians simply have more at stake there than we do. The Russians also have more at stake there than we do. For both Russia and for Iran, Syria, under the Assads, has been their one big, reliable ally in the Arab world. I mean, as a government, so I'm not counting the likes of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They would be very reluctant to give that up. And that's reflected in the effort that they have made in support of Assad during these last 9 years of civil war. I mean, my own sort of policy prescriptive view of this, as far as the U.S. side is concerned, we still have the small number of troops in the Northeast. I really don't see how they are going to serve a purpose, a useful one, with regard to reshaping Syria in a way that is more to our liking, whether it means less Russian influence, less Iranian influence, or somehow shortening the tenure of Bashar Assad. Our troops are in harm's way. I think this was one respect in which President Trump had the right first impulse when he talked about getting all the troops out of Syria. We should remember, why they went in the first place. It was, again, an anti-ISIS mission. And so it really is a matter of mission creep when you hear officials talking about, well, we have to stay there to keep an eye on Iran, or we're going to stay there until the Iranians get out. That's a big mistake, because the Iranians are not going to get out totally in terms of sacrificing their alliance. I mean, they're going to have drawdowns of personnel, and this applies to Lebanese Hezbollah as well. But that alliance is going to persist, and I think we have to deal with that. The main dimension that the U.S. has not taken full advantage of is the multilateral diplomatic dimension. Most of the diplomacy that's really mattered over the last couple of years has been a trilateral affair involving the Russians, the Iranians, and the Turks. It would be good to see the U.S. at that table and/or the UN shared table to play a constructive role in trying to find some kind of diplomatic settlement to the horror that's been the Syrian civil war.
Thank you. This is terrific. Thank you for your insight on this complex region.
It's been my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, first off, I would like to thank you, Dr. Pillar, for joining us today. I think everyone has very much enjoyed your talk, and you given us your time today to speak with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I'd also like to give a warm welcome and thank you to Dr. Negron Gonzalez, as well as Morris Sullivan, for filling in today for Tim while he's away. I would also briefly like to just plug our upcoming event on June 30th. Will be actually our last WACNH live event for the spring, which will be WACNH Live Asian Flashpoints with Dr. Patrick Cronin of the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin will be speaking on several regional flashpoints currently on the Asian continent, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and South Asia, as well as discussing those regions' responses to the coronavirus and what the U.S. can learn from their responses. So I would like to thank everyone for coming out today, for listening to the talk, and thank you to Dr. Pillar for joining us. Have a good night, everyone.